One of the things that really strikes me about all of the questions is that I think when it comes to trying to be helpful to other people, whether we're doing it as a local resident or we're doing it as a person who's paid to serve, or elected to serve, I think what we're all probably reasonably intent on doing is being helpful, being useful. There are very few people in this kind of work who are out to do intentional harm. That'd be fair to say? Maybe one or two, but very few actually. So most people, I think, really want to make change happen and want to do, particularly in public life. I don't really think, certainly in local governance, that most people are getting into it unless there's some intention towards good and an impulse to civic contribution. One of the things, whether it's coming from citizen to citizen, neighbour to neighbour, or whether it feels a little bit more removed and more top-down at times, I think one of the things to pay attention to is how I am as a helper showing up in the lives of the people I'm trying to help. And I want to talk a little bit about that by giving you two ways of thinking about helping. Because basically what I want to get to is I think that some helping is incredibly harmful. I think some of the ways that neighbours show up in the lives of their neighbours is really, really harmful. And I also think some of the ways that government and politicians are showing up in the lives of citizens is really harmful. But it's not intended, right? So it's done with the best of intentions. So I want to talk to that a little bit. I think one of the reasons why harm can be done in the name of helping is because we all are different. We all have different personalities and different ways of showing up. And my observation in community life and in institutional life is that there are probably three particular characters who are trying to do something in the civic realm, in the public realm, in community, if you like. The first is what I would call a lone wolf, okay? This is a person who essentially has big ideas, has kind of figured out what needs to happen and is driven to making it happen. And while they're brilliant when it comes, their gift is the big idea. Their gift is their energy and their ability to advocate for the big idea. Where they're profoundly challenged is in growing relationships with other people, particularly people who don't think their big idea is a good idea. And so in that instance, I think that the lone wolf really struggles with community. And the lone wolf would say, but hey, hang on a second here. It's obviously a good idea. I've got X number of people who support me. Nobody else is showing up. So what's the problem? Give me the money. Let's get on with the idea. Okay? And for a lone wolf, when you say to them, but you not think maybe getting other people involved is a good idea, maybe hearing their voice, genuinely, internally, they're saying no. With one exception. The only reason that they could imagine that getting people involved would be a good idea is if those people were doing something that advanced their idea, right? Lone wolves do not build community. They build ego, not eco, right? It's not their fault. I mean, we could get Freudian about it, but let's not, okay? And oh, okay. Batteries, I think, is it? Yeah. And that's just a harsh reality. It happens in communities regularly, where you might have somebody who is the key holder, thank you, is the key holder of a community centre. Okay, I'll just use my own assets. Is the key holder of a community centre, but the only people who can get into the community centre are the people that are his or her friends. So, this is about power, and often it's unconscious. People aren't aware they're doing it. So I would say that certainly asset-based community development, while it's not disrespectful or shaming of lone wolves, is not out looking for lone wolves. That's not where we'd start. That's one of the reasons why we very rarely would go into a community and say, let's talk to all of the community leaders and get a sample representation of all of the voices. Because my own view is what you'll end up a lot of the time with is a mixture of lone wolves and other people. And often very, very good, project-oriented people, so it's quite seductive. You say, but they get things done. Nobody else is showing up. What's the problem? I think that in many respects, that's a fair description of the kinds of community representative structures we have today in a lot of the parts of the world I work in, where people who have really powerful voices have shown up because they're rolling up their sleeves, they're willing to do something. And you know what they nearly always say? How do we get more volunteers? There's this crushing responsibility coming down on my shoulders. I'm doing all the work. Me and maybe 5 other people, and nobody else wants to get involved. What's going on? You know? And maybe what's going on is that the relationship building stuff that needs to happen to bring people in isn't being done well enough. But it's so hard to say that to a lone wolf, because they will hear that as a judgment. They'll get angry with you. And they'll refuse to talk to you because, after all, they're a lone wolf. So this is really, really important. It's a painful, harsh reality that much of what we're doing in an effort to grow a community is sabotaging ourselves if we occupy the position of the lone wolf. The second is the mobilizer. In my neighborhood, there's a lady. She is just amazing. But the only thing she cares about is St. Patrick's Day parade. All year long, she will talk to you about anything to do with that parade, but anything outside of that, she does not want to hear at all, right? So her whole world, her whole life, her whole reason for being is that parade. You know people like this? You probably know lone wolves as well. And this isn't to label people, but to an extent it's helpful to have an analysis of what's going on in terms of power. The mobilizer will mobilize projects. They've confused projects with progress. A lot of our institutions do too as well, by the way. They think if we fund projects, there's progress. Progress happens when relationships get deeper. Projects come out of that. But what ends up happening is they think it's just the project. So they decouple the relationships from the project. This is why when you go to meetings, you don't often see relationships being built. You see projects being planned. Right? There are people who are going to meetings, committee meetings for 27 years, carrying deep resentment and hatred, but they say nothing. You know? There's no relationship happening there. There's just a project. This isn't community either. So I'm not against projects, by the way. I think you can do both. I think you can build projects and build relationships together. But what I'm suggesting here is that sometimes mobilizers care more about the project than they do about the relationships. And sometimes they will actually roll over relationships to get their project over the line. And in business, we call that being cutthroat or business-minded, depending on your values. Okay? Getting the job done. Okay? The final one, I think, is why asset-based community development is useful as an approach. It's the community builder. It's the person either in civic life or in paid life who's trying to figure out, how do I come into a community and support people to get in relationship with each other and do the stuff together that they feel needs to be done? And also, as well as doing that, how do I make sure that the institutions that are there to support them are an extension of that capacity rather than a replacement of it or stifling it? That's what asset-based community development tries to understand and explore. If you're a lone wolf, you may think, so what? If you're a mobilizer, you may think, get me some volunteers, I'll listen for another while. If you're a community builder, you'll say, that's just obvious. And I think often in the institutional world and the community world, that's what's going on. We've got these folks talking at cross purposes. And what I want to propose is that the lone wolf is not the bad person. The mobilizer is not the bad person, and the community builder is not the good person. The challenge is not to get them all doing community building. The challenge is to find a way that we can all be in right relationship with each other, because sometimes we need to get things done. There's an emergency, there's a flood, we have to respond. We can't sit down and have a debate for 2 years about how we get every voice. We've got to do something now. Sometimes projects need to get done. Stuff needs to happen. And it's great when you've got an organizer who knows how to mobilize the troops and get things delivered. And sometimes you need community building. So it's not about getting everybody to march to the same drum beat, but it is about trying to figure out how we can use all of those assets And the problem a lot of the time is that the lone wolves and the mobilizers are really, really hostile and alienating towards the community builders. And the community builders tend to be, conflict avoiders. And so they get marginalized quite quickly. So this is just a thought that I wanted to kind of put into the room. It's a bit of a bombshell for some people, and for others it's just stating the obvious. Okay? You can figure out who you are yourselves. I don't want to label anybody. But what I'd like to do is just maybe invite you again, just for a few minutes, to have a conversation about that. You know, when you think about where you live, or you think about where you work, I guess the question I'd like you to ask each other is, how do we find the community builders and support them to have more of an active role? So I'm not interested for today in the lone wolves and the mobilizers. Bless them, but they get a lot of attention, okay? So they're good. It's coming up to Christmas. They'll probably be at every party, okay? But I want to just kind of try and pay a little bit more attention for now. We'll just give them an hour of our time today to these community builders. And so what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to find 2 people in the room you don't know, get into trios and have a conversation about where are these people called community builders in our neighborhoods and in our institutions, and how might we support them more? That's the question I want you to explore. So find 2 people you don't know, get in a group of 3 and have a conversation. How do we figure out how we can be alongside people that are different to us and still, object without being objectionable, disagree without being disagreeable? So I think part of it is practicing. A lot of our neighborhoods have become homogenized. This is very true in North America, where I do a lot of work. It's true in Australia. It's true in a lot of parts of Europe. And what I mean by homogenized, they're all the same. A lot of our online communities are even worse. I say my kids, they call what isn't online is called offline. So I say, no, don't do that. Call it on land. It's real, it's here. And on land, many of our groups are full of like-mindedness. We all get along, and we think that's a good thing. I think we have too much common ground and not enough diversity. I think we don't need less politics, we need more politics. We just need more people to be involved in it rather than handing it over to others. We need to get engaged. So that's what we're doing here now, I think. We're engaged in building community, inviting the diversity in. So we were curious with each other around this question of, without alienating the mobilizer or the lone wolf, how we could lift up the role and the function of the community builder in our neighborhoods, in our villages, in our institutions. So we live in a world where, the focus is very much on measurability, scalability, and being effective. More, faster, quicker, cheaper. That's kind of the world we live in. But what we've just heard there is not about being effective, it's about being affective. It's about the importance of relationship building. So it's this question that we come into community life with. Where are the people who are able to build relationships that are authentic and that are genuine? Where are those people who can welcome the gifts of children in? And you won't welcome the gifts of children in if you keep calling them names. Funny, call somebody names, they don't want to come to your party, okay? So calling people names, even with good intentions, like handicapped, which is a term I heard used yesterday in a workshop, or, even labeling with diagnostic labels that are medically correct, like intellectually disabled, immediately makes me think about what that person can't do. Homeless, I define them by the one thing they don't have, a home, and so on. Now, these are labels that, in one way or another, are really intended to try to address a problem or fix somebody or something. And I think when you've got a dominance of that, what you end up with is a lot of lone wolves and a lot of mobilizers, because that's the way things get done. Now, how asset-based community development is different, I think, is it says, yes, all of that has its place for sure. But what would happen if, instead of starting with the half-empty part of the glass, we started with the half full part of the glass. Instead of seeing people as needy and as deficient, we saw them as needy or needed, as required, as people we can't do without. What would happen then? So back in the late 80s, Professor John McKnight and Jody Kretzmann, the two founders of the asset-based approach, not model, but the approach, the perspective, if you like, way of life, began to realize that an awful lot of universities and an awful lot of institutions were kind of coming in like space invaders into the community and landing all kinds of services and programs, doing exactly what you were raising concern around earlier on. They would start their conversation with, tell us what's wrong with you. Tell us what you're missing. Tell us what you need. So every engagement started with a needs analysis. You know, what's missing? It's the half-empty part of the glass. And what was interesting is that every single needs analysis concluded the same thing, which was, well, what these people need are the services of those who are analyzing them. So that's really interesting, because who says, what I need is someone to love, somewhere to live, and something meaningful to do, but hey, now I need therapy apparently. Okay, let's have a look at that. But what's interesting is when I sit with people who've had a needs assessment done on them, which is the opposite of the asset mapping you're doing, and I say to them, okay, if I gave you my salary, my annual salary, how much of it would you use to buy the service that I think you need? And every single time people say not 1 cent. So that tells me that many of the space invaders, top-down stuff we're doing is not actually hitting the mark. Even by our own standards of efficiency, scalability, measurability, we're failing. Because if we treat people by what they're missing solely, the best we can ever do is create air-conditioned misery for them. Right? And you think about it, like years and years and years. I'm coming to the Netherlands for 10 years, so I've been to an awful lot of places and have, grown very, very deep relationships and friendships here. And one of the things that consistently strikes me is that in the name of helping, we've seen so many agencies coming into communities, often from silos. You know what I mean by silos, so different, distinct functions. So you have the agency that works with young people. You've got the agency that works with people with disabilities and mental health, and you've got the, so on and so forth. And we all know this. All of them are good people. They all mean well. But the difficulty is because they're working from separate silos, when they come into the community, what they do inadvertently is they round up, forgive the use of the term, aggregate, if you like. They bring together all of the people with the dysfunction that they think they can fix. And what you end up with is all the young people being together. We call them youth at risk. So somebody thinks that it's a good idea to take all the young people that we think are at risk and put them with other at-risk people, and somehow they're less at risk. Who came up with this? Or we're going to take all the older people and put them together by levels of vulnerability, frailty, and need. That's going to be a great place to age. I mean, they're just beating down the doors to get in there. And let's, because we have very little money and we're spending government money, let's make sure that we order all the chairs from the same catalogue. Have you been to any of these places? They all look the same. Okay? Sure, it doesn't happen or like that where you're from, but in other parts of the world. And so we've got this kind of idea that by aggregating people by their dysfunction and servicing them, that they'll have a good life. And what's happening over and over again now is people are saying, stop. It's not working. I'm getting good services, but I'm not getting a good quality of life. Wouldn't it be really interesting if instead of measuring the quality of our services, to go to your question of earlier, we started measuring quality of life of those that we serve? If instead of counting the number of people who are in our programs, we counted the number of relationships neighbor to neighbor people had outside of our programs. In other words, we said that success in the Netherlands isn't creating dependable services, but it's promoting interdependence in community life. Now, if we believed that, we would really value community building because it would be essential. But if all we're interested in is recruiting volunteers to do our project or recruiting clients to be in our service, We don't need community building. We don't need ABCD. Why would we want it? So that speaks to the question of why community building matters, I think. It matters because people want a life, not just a service. People want to be connected with each other. Services are important. We need them in all kinds of ways. My family personally over the last few months have needed services in so many ways I can't begin to tell you. So my dad died at the end of August. We had the hospice service, we had the hospital, we had all kinds of services, absolutely amazing. Some of them were absolutely horrendous. That's kind of life, it's the harsh reality. You have to negotiate your way through those. My 8-year-old son went in for keyhole surgery, cardiac surgery, and it went wrong. And we ended up in a situation where he needed emergency open heart surgery 3 weeks ago. Thankfully, he survived and he's well. Unbelievable professionals. A surgeon with the hands of God, as far as I'm concerned, as his father. And yet still we're trying to figure out here today, how do we get all of these things in right relationship with each other so people can have a life and have a service when they need it, so that professionals can do the kind of caring they really want to do, but not grow on healthy dependency. And I think that's really, really at the heart of why an asset-based perspective is so critical. Because what it says to us is, instead of starting the conversation with a deficit analysis, let's start it with an asset-based perspective. Right? Not so that we can ignore the needs, that's not the point. But what we know, and there are many people in the room who are in public service, and I think you'll probably agree with me on this point. If you're trying to serve communities, or serve even a wide city or a region, maybe even a country, depending on where your political career is at. I think one of the great challenges is, if we start the conversation with the people we serve with the question, what do you need, or what can I do for you? I think we end up in a relationship where they're the clients and consumers and we're the producers. Now, only two things can possibly happen here. Either we serve well and we get cheered on, or voted on, or whatever it might be, or we fail. And I think the reason that so many institutions are failing is not because they're bad, or the reason so many politicians are not trusted is not because they're untrustworthy. It's because we as citizens are expecting them to do the impossible. We're expecting them to do our living for us, our politics for us, our health creation for us, our community building for us. So the point I want to make here is pretty simple, actually, and it can be made with 3 questions. Right? The first question, in a democracy at least, that we would ask ourselves is, in order to be well and, to prosper around here, what is it that we as local inhabitants can do alone, that we don't need any outside help to do? What is that? Now, we might need bureaucracy to be moved out of the way to do it, okay? But what is it? And largely, I want to propose to you that in my experience, which is not endless, but over the last 22 years in particular in 35 countries, my experience is this, that what people are doing in community life to grow democracy, without any help really, without even funding a lot of the time, is not volunteering, or not just volunteering. Volunteering is important, but it's not the only way people are showing up to make a difference. There's lots and lots of people doing things neighbour to neighbour that they don't call volunteering. I have an 89-year-old neighbour who's just come back from a 3rd hip operation that hasn't gone well. I mowed his lawn. I am not volunteering to mow his lawn. I'm neighbouring. I'm being neighbourly. So there are all kinds of ways, I think, of showing up. And one of the things that we're finding is over and over again, when we say to people, so what do you care about enough to get involved in your neighbourhood? A lot of the time people are saying, I don't want to volunteer, particularly younger people. And the reason, this may be good news or bad news, but I can only tell you the truth as it's said to me. The reason they're giving is because they feel when they volunteer, they're volunteering into projects where they are not really a creator in the project. They're not a producer. They're foot soldiers, They're a heartbeat and a brain and a pair of hands. But they're not really making change happen. They're not primary drivers of it. And for whatever reason, we may like it or not, but younger people want to actually be change makers and not just foot soldiers. So that's a big thing to pay attention to. So I think that if we're really curious about what people want to do themselves, I think we would ask not what's wrong with you or what do you need from me, but what do you care about enough to act upon and how can I support you to do it? All I'm saying is, what we're finding is, people under the age of 35 are contributing not just as volunteers, and some are resistant to it. That's all I'm saying. But they do want to contribute. I think what I'm hearing them say is, they want to contribute in a whole set of diverse ways that perhaps aren't currently on the table. And by the way, you can check this. Look at the number of residents' associations in the Netherlands and the number of neighbourhood watch groups in the Netherlands that have people under the age of 18 in their groups. And I think the evidence is pretty clear. Look at your volunteering ratios and look at the age profile on them. I've looked at your statistics, so I know what's going on. I know the truth. And the truth is that people under the age of 35 are volunteering less and less and less. But what I want to highlight to you is that doesn't mean that they're not showing up in civic life. It just may mean that they're showing up in different ways. And if we did better community building and asked different questions, I think they'd show up more. Now go to your question. People that we've labelled and pushed to the edge and we've put in institutions, are they showing up in community life? Well, in all kinds of ways we don't know because we blocked them from doing it. Imagine if we created the conditions within which they could contribute. By instead of asking them what's wrong with them, we asked them what was strong with them and how would they like to share it. So that's really what I'm saying. I'm not pathologizing younger people at all. In fact, I would argue that there's no such thing as youth at risk. I think there are youth at promise. They're only at risk of adults who can't see that promise. So that's my belief. I don't think young people are leaders of tomorrow. I think they're leaders of today. We just keep saying, hold, wait, your time will come. So that's the point. So I think we're on the same page. I really do.
Could you make another suggestion, because I recognize what you're saying, but I think there is a second dimension, is that young people also tend to be reluctant to structurally engage, to structurally be obliged to stick to an activity. So with young people, I'm convinced that not only do you have to give them the room to be the change agent, but also allow them to be able to get quick result. And not be committed for years and years and years. You know, do something just in a few months. Sure. Give them the room to do that.
Yeah. No, it can be true. I marched with young people in Chicago a few months ago around gun crime and gun violence, and it was really interesting because the level of sophistication, the level of organizing, the level of commitment was incredible, and it was one of the more successful campaigns. And largely, that was all self-organized by young people. So I think when people care about something enough to act upon it, they find the resources and they mobilize, for sure. And it's always nice when you see some impact for what you do. I think that's really, really important. But I suspect that that's true across all age groups. Younger people may need, a little bit more immediate results, who knows, but it's true. Now, I think one of the things that I wanted to just mention really briefly, and then perhaps we can kind of talk a little bit more about how to do it on Monday morning, the kind of question about tools and resources. But one of the things I wanted to mention was when John McKnight and Jody Kretzmann, the founders, went into communities and started asking different questions. So instead of doing a needs analysis, they started saying, could you tell us stories about a time you and your neighbours came together to make things better? So not will you come and volunteer on my project, not what are your needs, but tell us a story about a time you and your neighbours come together to make things better. And what they started to discover was that actually under the radar, in ways that will not get registered by formal ways of measuring things, so it won't appear in a directory of community services, people are doing all kinds of things. There's like this huge reservoir of assets that are in neighbourhoods and they're invisible. So I think an awful lot of the work that we're trying to do and that you are sharing is how do we make the invisible visible? And one of the ways of doing that is let's stop inviting people to meetings. Let's stop inviting people just to volunteer or to be a leader. The change we seek doesn't come from the I have a dream podium. It comes from the thousands of people who are in the audience thinking they're spectators when in fact they are the change they seek. That's the challenge. And I think the big change, even though it's very simple to say it, it's hard to do it. The big change is, can we change from asking people to care about what we care about to listening to them describe what they care about and supporting them to do that? That's the change, right?
But why would you need community builders then?
Well,
Because
they're the
community
askers.
build themselves.
They're the askers. So it's a great question. So my own observation on this, I think it's great. Like, you know, the argument could be, if communities can do it already, why do we need community builders to go in and help? Right? It's a great question. Absolutely great question. And I've got a great answer, I think. You can tell me. I think, so it's really, some of you, I think, are reasonably sort of interested in psychology and sort of different things. So you may have heard of a guy called E.F. Schumacher. He wrote a wonderful book in 1973 called Small is Beautiful. Love that. It's just, there you go, beautiful. And he talked about an idea called intermediate technology. Okay, so basically what he said is technology, if it's too advanced, can actually, you know, displace people from work, and it can replace community. But if you give people the right level of technology, kind of an appropriate level of technology, they can use that to make a better life. So I think the reason, and I can tell you a wee story about this actually, it really illustrates the point. The reason that we need some light touch support, not the top-down parachuting support, but the kind of facilitative support is because I think communities are more likely to be individuals watching TV or busy at work than they are connecting. So even though the assets are there, they're invisible. So there's a job of work to make the invisible visible. Not alone to make the invisible visible, but also to welcome the stranger at the edge. You see, the Ku Klux Klan is a community. It uses all of its assets for hate. So communities face a challenge. And the challenge is that by definition, a community has insiders and outsiders. Right? It's got an invisible permeable, a kind of perimeter wall. And the role of a good community builder is to create some permeability, create some space so people can get out and people can get in. And people that society have exiled to service land can also bring their gifts. And my experience is that some communities have done that using local people alone. But as we press on people more and more in their lives to be workers and to be travelers and whatever, it's harder and harder to do that without some support. So my sense is that the community builder is an accelerant to the community assets that are invisible. They make them visible, and they also help the community to welcome the stranger at the edge. That's their contribution. And I see them as the caddies. I see the local residents as the golfer. So the community builder, if you like, is Robin. The community is Batman. And it's about really giving people the confidence and the connections to do that. That's why we use methodologies like asset mapping. Does that make sense?
Thank you for a good answer.
Thank you.
May I answer it?
Well, we have another question, so let me take that first and then we can come back. Yeah? Please.
Yes, thank you. I was wondering if there's a lot of things going well in communities which you don't see. What makes it so important to make it visible, and for whom?
Great question. Great question. So if I was to say to you that I think there are 6 resources in every community right now, but that the issue is that they're not being connected and mobilized, I would say that the 6 resources are the gifts, skills, talents of people themselves, many of which people don't know they have, for community work, not just for their own self-interest, right? So you can imagine if you went into every neighborhood that you work in or you live in and you found out what were the 3 things that every member of that community could contribute to the well-being of the community, what an incredible resource base you would tap into. I would propose to you that most people in your community do not know what that resource is right now. Okay? So the second is that there are clubs, groups, associations, the walking groups, the informal choirs, etc., that are probably doing their own thing. Imagine what would happen if we supported them more, if we cheered them on more, and if we said to them, could you welcome other people who are a little bit different to you but also have a gift to give? They'd probably say yes, but nobody's asking. Imagine if we were able to connect all of those associations together. So we had, instead of a residents association with people who are probably, getting back to age profile, over the age of 65 and doing the best they can do, but tired, we were actually able to create an association of associations. And that was able to sit and figure out, how can we live better around here, contributing what we have and sharing what we have. Imagine we were able to do that as well with the built-in natural environment, with our institutions, with our culture, and with our economy. I think that would be absolutely transformative, but it would be small and beautiful. And I think that's what we're not doing. I think what we're doing is we're saying, outside agencies, the cavalry over the hill, they're going to save the day. They're going to make us more prosperous. They're going to make us safer. We need more police, more speed bumps, more CTV cameras. That's what's going to keep us safe. But the truth is, when you actually do the community building, what you discover, and the evidence is clear on this, what keeps us safe, what determines our safety, is how many neighbours we know by first name and how active we are together. The communities that are safest are the communities that are more vibrant. If I took two people in this room, one who has no relationships with a club or a group or a neighbour, and the other who does, and I got the person with no relationships to join a group, I would medically guarantee you that I reduce the chances of that person dying next year by 50%. There is no doctor and there is no drug more powerful than community. So that's my answer to your question, I think. It's just that, but it's sitting there. And because it isn't marketable and it isn't scalable and it doesn't seem efficient, we are devaluing it because we live in a consumer society, right? And Eric Hoffer, the famous American philosopher, said, you can never get enough of what you don't really want, right? And a lot of what we're consuming, we don't really want. Eventually, it consumes us. So I think what people really want is they want connections, but it's very hard to know how to do it. So back to the other question again, why would we need community builders? Our research is very clearly saying that an awful lot of people are quite frightened of talking to their neighbours. They don't know how to start the first conversation. So they're getting engaged, if they get engaged at all, in representative structures, but not participatory structures. And that's why I think at neighbourly level, we need people who know how to do something useful about that. That's my thought. Now, it doesn't mean, and I'd like to share a story if I may. I think a story might be helpful now, actually, because we talked a bit of theory. So could I just share a quick story to illustrate this? Before I do, did you? Yeah? Okay? Yeah. So the story I want to share, I think, brings everything that I've been saying together in a kind of a reasonably nice narrative. And it also speaks to the question about asset mapping, so question of tools. And then perhaps we'll finish with some group conversation and final questions if you have. This all feels rushed, but it is what it is, and it's great to be together even for a couple of hours. It's precious time. So the story, I could situate the story in many different timelines, but I want to start telling you the story going back 7 years ago. It's a story about a place called Hodge Hill in Birmingham. It's an outer estate, so a lot of economic isolation, a lot of real challenges. And 7 years ago, David Cameron was the Prime Minister of the UK, or of Great Britain. And he came out with this, I guess his speechwriters did, but he came out with this narrative around what he called Broken Britain. And the media they really liked this because the media love often to report on our wounds. So they love this. Broken Britain, yeah, that's great. So it's the ultimate deficit-based way of looking. The whole country is deficit, or in spots. So basically what he was saying is there's all these categories of people who are just really annoying because we've been servicing them and they just won't change. You know, clearly there's something wrong with them. They're like an alien species and they just won't, So we tried nudging them, we tried servicing them, and they just won't, they're not amenable to being fixed, you see. And he started saying that that poverty has a postal code, which is true. There are places that are economically isolated. And he essentially started naming and shaming them. And the media started, helping him. So on almost a weekly basis for about 6 months, I have a vivid memory of different media outlets covering different neighbourhoods. there was a program on Channel 4 called Benefit Street, where they actually had a neighbourhood. They were claiming everybody was on benefits and receiving social welfare. So there was a lot of shaming going on. And one of the neighbourhoods that was being publicly shamed was this neighbourhood of Hodge Hill. About 5,000 people, and yes, there's a lot of poverty, a lot of issues, right? No doubt about that at all. So the glass was very firmly half empty, okay? But these people got really angry. I mean, they were so upset and so embarrassed, so shamed, and it had all kinds of knock-on consequences. Like when you would apply for a job, they wouldn't put their address down and, all of this kind of stuff. But they didn't know what to do because they had lots of lone wolves who had, independent ideas but couldn't actually get a base of people together. They had lots of mobilizers who had projectitis, but they had no community builder. And one day a guy by the name of Al Barrett arrived on the scene. And Al, an outsider, but actually moved in with his family to live there, so he became a near neighbour, not a salaried stranger. Right? He was, as it happened, a Church of England minister, but that's kind of not the point of the story. And he looked around and he thought, my goodness, there's 5,000 people here. I'm going to sit down. He's quite a bright guy. He said, I'm going to sit down and just work out the maths on how much money is coming into this community. Just curious, in the way of services and salaries and programs. And he worked out that if you took all of the money on any given year and you divided it among all of the people living there, that you would immediately take people out of poverty and make them all middle class. So he thought, how about I don't provide any services? Now, he's a Church of England minister, so one of his impulses is, well, maybe we should set up a food bank because people are hungry. And he resisted the impulse. Not because he lacked empathy, but because he understood there's a difference between empathy and sympathy. And instead of setting up a food bank, he thought, well, how about we set up a community kitchen based on the assets of people that actually live in this community? And how about every time somebody comes to get food, we ask them what they're good at, and if they can cook, we invite them to share their gifts. So you begin to blur the boundary between the helper and the helped. See, this is a perfect way, by the way, to create abusive environments, where you have two classes of people. You've got all the good people up here who are the helpers. Right? They don't need anything. And then you've got all the needy people down here. They're the ones, they're the problem ones. We've got to fix them. You create that scenario, abuse is almost inevitable. And that's why we have so much scandal and abuse in our institutions, because we've created these tiered societies within them. So he said, let's not do that. And he thought, well, if money was the problem and programs were the solution and services were the solution, we wouldn't have any problems anymore, so let's not do that. So what he did instead was he found 7 people and he said, how about instead of having project campaigns, or campaigns that try to change our government and get our leaders to get their act together, he said, you know what, if we're waiting for our leaders to get their act together before we act, we'll never act. Let's just pretend our leaders have got their act together as much as they're going to. And instead of trying to get the cavalry to come in from over the hill, let's start from inside out. Let's do what we can with what we have and build some confidence around here.
Where did these 7 people come from?
They were neighbours. So it's really interesting. So what he was really intentional about was finding people who were interested in weaving the community by relationships. So they were local people.
People were not involved in those silos, in those institutions.
No. So they were people, that kind of responded. You know the way different people respond to different calls. So some people love the leadership call, others love meeting calls, others volunteering. It's okay, they're all. But the call that he put out was, if you really like the idea of going out and giving your community a good listening to, actually going out, not talking about what's wrong, but what's strong, well, let me know. Because what I want to do is spend the next 12 weeks going to places where people bump into each other and gather and actually just have intentional conversations. Now, he always knew the people, because they just say, yeah, sounds like a great idea. We should have done that for years, but we haven't. So he found 7 people who were willing to do this. And he said, we need to be a bit strategic here, because we can't be left to do this year in, year out on our own. So what we're trying to discover in this community of 5,000 people are who are the natural relationship builders, who are the connectors. So he said, my thought is, why don't we, the 8 of us, go out and try to find all of the unsung heroes in this neighbourhood, all of the people who are doing things to build relationships and build stronger community, the weavers. And what's interesting is these connectors are not leaders. They're typically not chairing meetings. They're much more behind the scenes people in my experience. Because what they're interested in is helping people get connected that are not connected and then get out of the way. They're not trying to grow a followership. They're trying to support connectorship. It's different. So they went out and they had these conversations for 12 weeks, and it was over and over again. Do you know anybody who's really good at connecting folks up together? Building relationships, getting people to feel confident and get active. Oh yes, you should talk to Mary, you should talk to Cormac. And they got 93 names. And they knew they were onto something because every time they heard a name repeated 4 times, what they would do is they'd go and visit that person. And of course, these were neighbours. So they went, they visited, they said, you know what, your neighbours are talking about you behind your back. And this is what they're saying. They delivered a living eulogy to the person. This is the kind of stuff you never hear. And if you're lucky, they say it about you at your funeral. And they kind of said, let's just accelerate this a little bit. You know, do it while they're alive. It might be useful to them. And they, you know, it was really, really striking because I was involved in some of it peripherally. And just watching the emotional reaction that people had when they were validated for those contributions. And what nearly every one of the 93 people said was, I just thought that was normal. It's just doing what comes naturally to me. So it's like they came into the world ready-made connectors, you know, and they never saw it as a contribution. They just saw it as a way of being.
Was there a budget involved?
Sorry?
Was there a budget involved from the government or local government?
So this guy, as he started, he just had whatever salary he was getting, I guess, from the Archbishop. So he had his emolument or whatever. Lots of government people, but they weren't involved at that early stage. They weren't involved. Today, the big lottery fund that initiative to the tune of €500,000 or £500,000, whatever that is in euro. So it has grown. And they really have all the dilemmas of, oh my goodness, are we becoming institutionalized? But it's local residents who've become community builders and so on, because there's a lot of very serious, complex issues in that community, from child abuse, you know, really complex issues that require some support. So the government has gotten involved laterally, but I'll get to that really quickly because it's a good question. Yeah, it's the dilemma, right? So, long story short, because we'll run out of time if I don't tell you it quickly, these 93 people were invited to come to a party. This is 7 years ago. And to bring 4 neighbours from their street along with them that they thought would be interested in building stronger community. Okay? So people who weren't pointing up to the, you know, the crest of the hill, but were saying, let's have a better look at what's happening around here. As a starting point, it's not about letting the government off the hook. It's about doing what we can so that when we then sit with government, we're not sitting as passive consumers or as complainers. We're sitting as powerful citizens who have demonstrated our power and now are asking for a match. And we're also sitting with inclusion. We're saying, hey, we've figured out how to get all the voices involved. So it's not just all these different factions heckling at you, trying to bully you into doing what they want, but it's actually a collective vision. So that night, he sat with 93 people plus their neighbours. So literally, he went from himself to 7 people to 100 and, you know, whatever, to 500 people in the room. And what I love about what he did was he didn't introduce any content. He didn't deliver any programs. All he did was go into discovery mode. He was doing community building, right? To the horror of our lone wolves and our mobilizers, it has to be said. So it was a bit disruptive. But nonetheless, when 500 people are in a room, and these 500 people on average have relationships between, you know, with between 80 to 100 of their neighbors, that's awesome. And they're not trying to ram their agendas or their projects down anybody's throat, because actually they care about the 4,500 people who aren't in the room. And so almost automatically, as well as having a celebration, they start talking about, well, what might be possible? What's our vision? And essentially, without even having to be trained or told, they asked the questions in the sequence that I describe. What can we do together ourselves to include our neighbours? What can we do with some help from outside? And what do we want outside agencies to do for us? Over a 2-year period, having lots and lots of small parties and conversations and some meetings too, because meetings are important when you have something to discuss in advance. The problem is we overuse meetings. We expect them to do everything. They're good for, you know, advancing actions. They're not so good for building relationships. But throughout the process, over 2 years, they included 5,000 voices. And they created a vision for what kind of community they hope to see, they will see, because they plan to create, they want overnight. And it's very clear that they're saying this we can do ourselves, this we can do collaboratively with outside agencies, so they can speak to your agency and say, hey, you know what, we really need some help with this. Can you support us? We can do this, but we need your help with this. So you're really sitting with them as collaborators, as co-partners. It's not, oh, these people are needy. It's these people are partners. They're citizens, and we're in service of them. We're serving while walking backwards. And then finally, when they sat with Birmingham City Council, which is the largest council in Europe, they said, so here's the story. Over the last 2 years, we've spoken to everybody in the neighbourhood, and we found a way of creating a vision for the next 10 years. We know what we can do ourselves with what we have. We know what we can do with some support from agencies, and we know what we need you to do for us. There's nobody in our neighbourhood eager to take over collecting the rubbish bins, for example. We're very happy for the government to continue to look after the sewerage system. That's great. Keep doing that. And there's a whole range of other things we really need you to do for us. We need you to help us to deal with outside commercial interests that are doing harm to our communities. We need you to help us with the fact that our streets are no longer for feet, they're for tires. We could really use your help with that. And it was fascinating because I know this community from 10 years ago, and it was a place that just had constant fights between citizens and public servants. That's what it was. It was just constantly arguing, getting nowhere. And there was a poignant moment about 3 years ago when I sat in one of these as an observer. And it really struck me that I found it hard to tell who was the expert and professional in the room. Because there's just this incredible sophisticated conversation, which both released the gifts of the citizens, but interestingly, also the gifts of the politicians and the public servants too. So everybody got to come with their assets. But that takes time. Not a huge amount of time. It takes years though. And this is to the question, wonderful question that I had emailed to me. I wanted to hold it as the last coup d'etat, right? Because it's so important. So what does this all mean for democracy and for politics? And so I think the challenge in this country is that most change happens at the speed of a funding cycle or an election cycle. Kind of the 3-year funding cycles, 1 year setup, 1 year delivery, 1 year wind down. And it's a broken model. It just doesn't really serve anybody. The other issue with it is in terms of funding is that funding has an unstated rule. It says that for you to win, your neighbour must lose. It's the opposite of building community. So we have programmed communities to say that I won't do anything until I get the funding to do it. So we're already automatically saying that the assets that matter are external to our community. And so I think what we're really beginning quite excitedly to see is that some communities are saying, hold back. We've got to go not at the speed of a funding cycle or an election cycle. We've got to go at the speed of trust. So what's exciting is that really savvy public servants and politicians are taking power out of the bureaucracy, where it's limited and it will always get stifled, and they're giving it to the communities again. Because they're saying, you know what, if we try to create innovation in our institution, you know what will happen? Our institution will produce antibodies to kill the innovation off. So let's find these connectors and these local entities that are really prepared to bring in all of the voices, to do that work, because we can't do it in isolation. We need help. So that's a big, big insight, I think, and that's something that Birmingham City Council said at that meeting. You know what? We trip over our own feet because of our bureaucracy. We accept that. But let's talk about what you can do that we can't. Let's figure out the limits of our bureaucracy and the possibilities that you have. And they literally started figuring out how to collaborate with each other. And I think that's the challenge of democracy as we go forward. How can we stop the conversation that says, let's ask all of these citizens what they need by treating them as clients, and start the conversation that says, in a democracy, politics is with the people. We've got to empower them. Democracy works, but give people the space to connect, to see their assets, and to liberate them. Three things I've said today, and I'll conclude with this. The first is we need to shift away from delivering programs to discovering assets first. Second, I said that instead of selling our content, we should be emphasizing the importance of promoting contact neighbor to neighbor. And finally, I suggested that our starting point, our middle point, and our entry point is to start with what's strong. Now,